So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session at the LLF. I'm Syima Aslam. I'm the director of the Bradford Literature Festival, which is based in the heart of the UK in Yorkshire. And it's my very great pleasure today to be hosting this session with Soniah Kamal. So I'm going to do a very brief introduction because Soniah is a very illustrious personage. In fact, when I started looking at her biog, I thought I won't actually be able to remember all of this. So Soniah is an award-winning essayist and fiction writer. Her debut novel, An Isolated Incident, was the finalist for the Townsend Award for Fiction and also for the KLF French Fiction Prize, which I would like to ask you about. I was slightly puzzled by that. Her short story, Jelly Beans, was selected for the Best South Asian Short Stories Anthology in 2017. And her TEDx talk is on Regrets and Redemption, which is a very interesting title, which sounds like it's got a lot of history behind it.
No, not too much. No, it does.
She has an MFA in creative writing from George State University, and she's a Paul Bowles Fellow in Fiction. Born in Pakistan, she grew up in both the UK and Saudi Arabia and is currently residing in Georgia. Now, today we're actually going to be talking about her new book, Unmarriageable, which is a parallel telling of Pride and Prejudice set in contemporary Pakistan. And it's received brilliant reviews, so I would urge you, actually, that if you haven't read it, to go out and get it and read it. I mean, I was really intrigued when I was asked to host this panel. I was really delighted because Pride and Prejudice is one of my favourite books. So I thought, you know, here's a new version to dive into. So the first thing I really wanted to ask you, Soniah, was what inspired you to write the book? Apart from Austen's work, why set it in Pakistan in this way?
Well, first of all, thank you, Syima, for agreeing to do this, and LLF for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, everyone who has come out to hear about Unmarriageable. Well, I am a Jane Austen fan. I love her work. The first time I read Pride and Prejudice, I was 16 years old, and I remember as soon as I finished the novel, I said, this is the quintessential Pakistani novel. Jane Austen was Pakistani 222 years ago when we didn't even know we were going to be Pakistani.
All the best people from Pakistan.
So, you know, it's a story, the bare bones of it is about a mother who's frantic and desperate that her 5 unmarried daughters get married and married well. And her daughters, some of them, have very different ideas about what they want to do with their life. So the main conflict is there. But as I grew older, and I found out and read history and the reason that we're even speaking in English right now, and that English is one of the official languages in Pakistan, I became very intrigued by that, the division of language within Pakistan, the class division that shows also, and what that implies as a country, as a nation. And I'm going to read out a quote from our favorite colonial, Babington Macaulay, from his an address to the British Parliament on 2nd February 1835. I have travelled across the length and breadth of India, and I have not seen one person who is a beggar, who is a thief. Such wealth I have seen in this country, such high moral values, people of such calibre, that I do not think we would ever conquer this country unless we break the very backbone of this nation, which is her spiritual and cultural heritage, and therefore I propose that we replace her old and ancient education system, her culture. For if the Indians think that all that is foreign and English is good and greater than their own, they will lose their self-esteem, their native culture, and they will become what we want them to become, a truly dominated nation. So with that background, my enjoyment and love of Austen took a more serious turn, per se. And I started to question the reason that I had grown up in English. My father is Urdu speaking. My mother is originally from Srinagar, Kashmir. My maternal grandparents lived with us. So we had 3 languages spoken at home. We had Urdu, we had Kashmiri, and we had English. And I grew up in England for a while also. And I fluently understand Urdu and Kashmiri, and by dint of settling in the Punjab, some Punjabi also. But there are two ways you can read policy, linguistic policy, and you can either become very angry about it, or you can accept that history is what it is, and what can you do to put a positive spin on it? And I decided that for me, taking my Pakistani culture and the English language, which, let's face it, is the language of opportunity and privilege, and fuse the two together and bring Austen and literally rewrite Pride and Prejudice and set it in Pakistan, which is what I wanted to read when I was 16 years old. And there's a huge debate in the novel about Urdu versus English and what it means and what it doesn't mean. And a lot of the dialogue, I mention a lot of Urdu writers in the novel, as well as writers from every continent. And there's an ongoing post-colonial dialogue within the novel itself, and especially between my Elizabeth Darcy and, Elizabeth Bennet.
and you're jumping ahead of yourself.
I'm jumping ahead of myself. She's already Elizabeth Darcy, although it's a Darcy Bennet. But, the two main characters, they have an ongoing conversation about what it means to have a language, not have a language, to belong and not belong.
And it was something that I was really struck by when I was reading this, because you actually draw out the disparity between language in terms of the class structure really, really clearly. And you were mentioning the books. I have to say, when I was reading this, I was actually making a list because I was thinking, oh my God, there are all these books and I haven't read them. But it was really interesting, those comparisons. The thing that I really wondered about was how much of Alice, Elizabeth Bennet, Alice in the novel, how much of Alice is actually based on you? Because I was really interested in those parallels about where Alice has lived and where you had lived. And,
yes.
And obviously, this is a dialogue that you're having with yourself.
Yeah. Alice is a third culture kid. She grew up partly in Saudi Arabia before moving back to Pakistan, which mirrors my history too. I grew up partly in Saudi Arabia and came back to Pakistan, which for me was a bit of a culture shock. I'd gone to a co-ed school over there. Things were you would think it's Saudi Arabia, but I went to an international school, which was akin to going to a mini United Nations. There were kids from everywhere. And suddenly I come back to Pakistan and, everyone's brown. So it was a reverse shock in a way. And it was an interesting process to re-assimilate in people who look like you versus belong in a group where everyone might look different and yet come from histories which are still very similar to yours, histories and experiences and stuff. So I gave that background to Alice also. How much of Alice is in me? I'd like to say nothing and everything. All these characters are a part of me. When writers write, we tap deep in, and even the not nice characters like Wickham, he was not very nice in Pride and Prejudice, I'm sure.
But very gorgeous. I have to say. I mean, I read that description and I was like, wow, I can see why she's falling for him.
Why Alice is, not me. But, so there's a bit, even Mr. Collins, even when you're writing, you dig deep into your psyche and you pull out some ugly things, some ridiculous things, some nice things in order to fully represent the characters that you're writing on the page. So yeah, I am Alice, but I'm not Alice too. So yeah.
Now, one of the things I was really struck by was the names in the novel. And I mean, I laughed at some of them because I was like, okay, now this is really interesting. Because, you've drawn some very, very clear parallels. And you can literally, I mean, as soon as I picked it up, I was like, okay, I can tick them off. I know exactly who everyone is. But Wickham's, I mean, how did you come up with those names? Because some of them are slightly, not fantastical, but I mean, they're very interesting.
They're imaginative. So are you referring in particular to Georgiula Wickham?
Georgiula Wickham. I mean, I was like, this is really interesting. Where does this come from?
Okay, so every character in Unmarriageable has a history, an origin of their name. So Valentine Darcy, and I won't say why he's Valentine. You'll have to read it for that. But Darcy, like my Mrs. Bennet, once Darcy says that Alice is not good enough for him, Mrs. Bennet gets very upset, and she's like, well, they were probably Darzy's piche se, and ab Darcy ban gaye, So.
And we've all been there and heard that one.
Yeah. So I was very particular about the names that I chose. I laughed at them, but I also gave them origin stories. Georgiula Wickham, and Wickham, he's Wickham. I've spelt it with a double A, which means ordinary. And Georgiula comes from, it's a private joke between me and my best friend, just Georgiula. That said, I don't know if anyone remembers, a few years ago, there was, I believe, a TV show called George Ka Pakistan. And that always struck me as very interesting, but then because they're not making a show called Soniah Kamal. So I was always like, okay, George, you want to be Pakistani? Here you are, you're Georgialla. So it came from there.
So one of the other things that I found really, really interesting about the book was that actually when you read Pride and Prejudice, or when you watch that BBC adaptation, I'm assuming everybody saw the BBC adaptation because
and
we all want to see.
if you haven't, you must. It's my favorite.
Because, you know, Colin Firth, you must see this adaptation. Well, it was a brilliant adaptation. I think Mrs. Bennet always gets, I mean, you know, you read the book and there's times when you just think, shut up, don't say that. Just be quiet. And, you know, you have that same feeling when you're cringing alongside Elizabeth and Jane when you're watching the adaptation. But actually in your book, she's really sympathetically treated. You can actually see exactly where she's coming from. Now, how much of that is actually a reflection on Pakistan and where we are?
Very much so. I mean, you can write caricatures and really ridiculous people. But I think when you're writing well-rounded characters, when you're trying to write people on the page, no one is ridiculous for themselves. Everyone's anxieties, everyone's motives, everyone's likes and dislikes come from a very deep place within themselves. And yes, Mrs. Bennet and my Mrs. Binnet say extremely silly things. At one point, my Mrs. Binnet tells my Mr. Bingley that Jane's vomit is of a very dignified hue, which is an utterly silly thing. Why would you even say something like that? It's in context in the book. So
she's desperately trying to redeem what she's already said.
But you know, the fact is, she's got 5 daughters. They're unmarried. The elder 2 are nearing 32, 33. And because of a scandal that has taken place in the book, they're not getting the proposals she thinks they deserve. And she's coming from a place of extreme frantic worry. Even though all of my characters work and earn, in her heart, in her mind, even though they have a career, and even though Alice wants to concentrate on her career, that's not good enough for her mother. Her mother doesn't believe that until she gets married and has kids, she will live a fulfilled and happy life. And she says, like, I know some of you have heard your parents say this. We're talking from experience, you know? We're your best friend. We know what's good for you. So she's coming from that place. And really, I understand all the reasons people do things. Yes, of course, it's annoying. It's annoying to be told such things. It's annoying to not have a mother or a parent who will trust that you know how you want your life to go. But, you know, she's still a human being on the page at the end of the day and not some silly woman just cracking silly jokes.
And I thought the other thing that I thought was really interesting was that when you read Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Bennet is, you know, he's this long-suffering, you know, you feel for him. He's saddled with Mrs. Bennet, and you think, poor man, no wonder he's behaving like this, and he's just locking himself in his library. And yet with Mr. Bennet, you just think, you know, get your act together. You know, poor woman. So it was really interesting the way you had actually changed that.
You know, a lot of times our reading of Pride and Prejudice is very much coloured by the adaptations, be it 1995, be it 1985 adaptation, or even the Keira Knightley, the most recent one. And then, you know, where Mr. Bennet is shown in contrast to Mrs. Bennet as a very sympathetic parent. You know, he's got Alice's back, and you know, interestingly enough, we see a father-daughter relationship where the two get along. They have a, you know, fusion of mind and spirits and intellect. So we tend to be very soft on Mr. Bennet. But look at it this way. In Austen's time, Elizabeth refusing to marry Mr. Collins was a disaster. In Regency England, 222 years ago, women, they could not work. They could not own property. They literally, there was nothing they could do for financial security except get married. And if they did not get married and their father passed away, as we see even in Downton Abbey, the property goes to the first male heir. So you could literally become destitute, as we see actually in Emma with Mrs. Bates. You know, so this was a huge threat. So Mrs. Bennet panicking about wanting her daughters to get married, wanting Elizabeth to get married to Mr. Collins, whether she likes him or not, and love. And I have to say, for 222 years ago, Austen was very progressive when she had her heroines wanting to marry for love, because that was not the important thing there. When you are going to end up on the streets and someone somewhat decent proposes to you, love might not necessarily be the first thing on your mind. So, yeah. And really, writing this, since I wrote a parallel retelling, Pakistan is not Regency England. I mean, it is not Regency England. Women are so highly qualified, have been for a long time. I know in the audience, I'm talking to CEOs and teachers and women who, women who are doing so much and earning a very, very good income on their own and not necessarily needing to get married. And so for me to find reasons for why my Elizabeth, Jane, and Charlotte Lucas, who ends up with Mr. Collins, finding a concrete reason in contemporary Pakistan for them to marry the buffoons and baboons that they end up with was not the easiest thing at all.
But do you think, I mean, it's interesting that you say that, because obviously, women now are educated and working and, and yet, do you think what is reflected in the book is the fact that the stamp of you've actually made it, you've done what you need to do is you're married, you're now secure, you're married, you're going to have children, you're doing what you are meant for. Do you think that is still very much part of society?
I mean, I think depending also on what religion you come from, marriage is an important part and parcel of your life trajectory and the milestones that you're expected to achieve. I think, I think even 20 years ago, if you were 20, 24, you were considered over the hill if you weren't married. And I think with time, that age has certainly gone up. I know women who are waiting till they're in their 30s, mid-30s, late 30s, which is a good thing. Things change gradually. But, we are a Muslim majority country. And if you belong to that religion where dating and other things are frowned upon, legal, there is only really one way to legally do something which you do when you're married. So...
Which
that is
the book
a huge
is very
part of it.
explicit about,
yeah.
And yes, and tackles really fearlessly. We have about...
It's a funny book. It's not that, it's serious, but it's funny. Everyone's like, oh, it says Unmarriageable. It's supposed to be funny. It's funny.
No, I mean, I have to say, I picked it up and was really, really busy and obviously was going to be chairing the session, but then I was completely drawn in. And I was like, I have to put this down because I do have other things to do. But it is a book that really draws you in. And it is... I mean, I don't live in Pakistan, but being of Pakistani heritage, you read it and you can hear the sentences. All the things that your mother has said to you, or your aunties have said to you, and all the comments that you've had over time. And I think the title in itself is really, really interesting. In fact, on the way here, we had a conversation with two gentlemen who both said they were unmarriageable. And this thing about and Soniah was saying it's normally girls who are told.
Well, I just said that it's interesting to me that you are calling yourselves unmarriageable. You have the agency to crack jokes about that. But often for women, they're the ones who are told they're unmarriageable, which puts them in a very different time, a very different place with that particular word. It's one thing if I call myself ugly, but to be told I'm ugly is a completely different thing. So yeah, and then the title came about in a really funny way too. I did not know what to call this novel. I wanted it to be one word, and I was thinking of all sorts of things. And there's a lot of discussion on class and society. I mean, Austen for me is not predominantly a romance writer, although the movies have popularized that. Because it's a movie, they need to focus on the love story. For me, she's an absolutely brilliant satirist, social critique. She's wonderful. And part of her longevity is that her novels read so fast. Her pacing is terrific. She doesn't preach. But, so I wanted something which I would have picked up. And it so happened, by the grace of, the universe, my husband and I had a bit of a spat. And we fought, and I walked off in a huff, and I was like, he's so unmarriageable. And I was like, that's my title, I have it. And I immediately texted him, and I was like, we have our title. And then I turned around, and that's marriage, right?
So we're short on time, so I'd just like to open it up to the audience. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask Soniah? Lady there? Do we have any mics? Do we have any roving mics?
Scream.
We're in a small room.
Yes.
I'm so excited to hear about this book because I'm a huge Austen fan. And,
like a lot of Pakistanis, yeah.
a lot of Pakistanis for the reasons you outlined. Pride and Prejudice is manifested in so many ways over the years. I mean, we've had Pride and Prejudice and zombies. We've had the Bride and Prejudice.
Sea monsters. Yeah. Yeah. I think the adaptations, like I said, focus on the love story, and there's a lovely love story through all of them, and people like to watch that. But I think if it's the books that you're concentrating on, Austen would have been a psychiatrist or a psychologist today. She can piercingly, I mean, you read any character description of hers and you know that person still exists. And I think that's that's a huge reason she's existed, as well as, like I said, her pacing. She's a very modern writer. She doesn't do what necessarily Dickens or Thackeray or other Victorian writers or writers from the Regency period would do, which was going to huge pages of preaching. And they were serializing their novels, so they had to fill pages. But nevertheless, she doesn't do that. And they're fast reads. So, yeah.
Fast-paced. One more question before we wrap up. Does anybody else have a question? No, I think, Sonia,
I guess I've said it all.
You said it all. Sorry, lady there.
So I already know this, but I think you're very interested in the rest of the audience.
Oh, no.
How you wrote it.
Okay, so my first novel, An Isolated Incident, took me 10 years to write. And Unmarriageable took 2 months to write. It was my MFA thesis, and it so happened that there was a glitch, and I only had 2 months to write it. And I'd been wanting to write this since I was 16 years old. And I was very intimidated by what I wanted to do, because it's post-colonial, it's told from a feminist lens. Honestly, when you take on a classic as beloved as Pride and Prejudice, and you do a parallel retelling, you're trying to fill some really huge shoes. It's very, very, very scary. I didn't have time to be scared in 2 months. I had to deliver a thesis. It was the biggest blessing in disguise. I would still probably be talking, I'd still probably be telling all my friends, yeah, I plan to do this someday and never get around to it. But I did. So for all the writers in the audience, sometimes just give yourself a deadline and just, get it out.
Just crack on with it. So we're going to have to wrap up. And on that note, you would not be able to tell from reading this. Sorry.
I have a question.
Sure.
We were talking about Mr. Bennet, and one reading saying it's sympathetic. Another interpretation is where Elizabeth, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Elizabeth analyzes her father, and at that point in time, it's when she's told her father he should control
Lydia, yes.
thing. I find it very interesting that she talks about how her father had 5 daughters and then gave up since a son wasn't coming, and then took to the library. And at that point, what I see of Austen is that Elizabeth is blaming her father for not being a supportive husband and making Mrs. Bennet more of an entertainment.
Yeah,
So how do you...
yes, readers tend to not realize that when Pride and Prejudice begins, and once again, I think this is partly the doing of the movies, where we immediately see Mrs. Bennet and Elizabeth in conflict. She doesn't start out in conflict with her mother. When Mrs. Bennet sends her elder sister Jane to a rich man's house in the rain on horseback, she wants her to fall ill because she wants Mr. Bingley to invite her to stay the night, because she's hoping overnight they will fall in love and get married the next morning. And Elizabeth says that is a good idea. It's only when it rains really hard and a letter comes that Jane is really sick, and then Elizabeth gets scared that she could die, because in those days this was still a time when doctors routinely used leeches to bloodletting to cure. You could get a toothache, and next you could get an abscess and you're dead. So it was medically a very precarious and scary time. But I don't want to use the word blame. What Elizabeth starts to do is she starts to see her parents for who they really are, as individuals in their own right, and as 2 people who are trying to make a marriage with each other, and what that relationship means and doesn't mean in her family and otherwise. So, Mr. Bennet is not the best father, honestly. He's a very neglectful father, and, yeah.
And neither is Mr. Binath in this. So I'm afraid our session is now over. Sonia will be signing copies, and there are copies available in
Hall 1 at Liberty Books, and I'm happy to sign books over there.
Please do.
Actually, I'm more than happy to sign books over there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.